Welcome to the session on conflict macro. I've got 3 papers, each lasting half an hour overall, including discussion. The first one is Laura Guibert, Measuring the Economic Cost of the 2007-2008 Post-Election Violence in Kenya. You've got about 15 minutes.
Okay. Good morning to everyone. I'm Laura Guibert from the Navarro Center for International Development, and I'm going to present a paper called Measuring the Economic Cost of the 2007-2008 Post-Election Violence in Kenya. So first I'm going to start with the motivation. I want to start saying a sentence that Samuel Kiwitu told after the elections took place, which was, I don't know whether Kibaki won the election. Kibaki was the actual president who was elected. So you can imagine how was the results in the Kenyan. So first, the motivation. After the allowance of multi-party democracy, Kenya has had four general elections, 1992, 1997, 2002, and 2007. And the one that took place 2 weeks ago. And in all of them, there has been a common factor of violence. So in the one that took place December 27th of 2007, Kibaki from the Kikuyu ethnic group and from the Party of National Unity won the presidential elections despite Odinga from the Luo ethnic group and the Orange Democratic Movement alleged electoral manipulation. Actually, this was confirmed by an exit poll by the US that said that the Odinga should have won the elections by 6 points margin. So in the ensuing days of the elections, 1,200 people were killed. There was massive destruction of property in some areas, and there several hundred thousand Kenyans were displaced, and there was 365 cases of sexual violence. So the problem in Kenya is that ethnicity of candidates remains the key mobilizer of political support. It is seen as having a relative in the state house could increase your access to the national cake. So it is viewed as the preservation of power and resources that someone can achieve. So in a survey, the majority of Kenyans, actually 70%, thought the election was dishonest. But that varied among the ethnic groups. For example, the Kikuyu, only 33% thought it was dishonest, and the Luo, 99%. However, it's difficult to know how the country would have evolved in the absence of that political stability. So the objective of this paper is to measure the economic cost that the 2007 election had in the Kenyan economy. The method that we used is called the synthetic control method. We used it to construct a synthetic Kenya based on a weighted combination of other African countries that best resembles the characteristics of the real Kenya without the post-election violence. And it is obtained that the 2007 post-election violence had a negative impact on per capita GDP. Actually, in 2009, per capita GDP in the actual Kenya was estimated to be 6% lower than its synthetic counterpart. So this is the definition of the synthetic control method. And a simple comparison between Kenya and its synthetic counterpart after the years of the election may not only reflect the post-election effect, but also other pre-election characteristics which affect economic growth. That's why we compare the evolution during the post-election violence with a weighted combination of other African countries that best resemble some economic characteristics that I will explain later before the election. The objective, as explained before, is to observe and measure the event of interest, in this case the post-election violence, the 2007 election. So the effect is calculated by the difference between the post-election event outcomes of the Kenya and its synthetic control, which is given by that vector. So the data is unsampled. First, I included in the data from 1991, which was the first year that the multi-party democracy was allowed. But then, every time an election was taking place, there was a decrease in economic growth and a factor of violence. So the data was distorting the synthetic country to be accurate. That's why the annual country panel data started from 2002 until 2011. The outcome variable is GDP per capita, PPP adjusted, and these are the set of economic growth predictors that we use: per capita GDP, population density, FDI inflow, agriculture, service and industry value added, energy production and inflation rate, exports and imports, and life expectancy. We included life expectancy because we consider it is an important predictor when accounting for African economies, because it's a measure of human capital that measures the health of the population. And the donor pool are 21 African countries that are the ones listed here. So I'm going to focus on the results because we don't have much time. So the first table compares the pre-election characteristics of Kenya, the synthetic Kenya, and the donor pool. So in this table, you can see how well the weighted combination of control countries can reproduce the actual Kenya. There are two determinants that cannot be perfectly reproduced, which is the foreign direct investment, because Kenya is among all the donor pool the one with lowest FDI, so a weighted combination of other African countries won't be able to reproduce it. And then the energy production, because Benin accounts for 50% of the synthetic Kenya and only has 1,700 energy production measured as KT of oil equivalent, and Kenya has almost 14,000. But you can see how the donor pool by itself is not a good comparison group, because, for example, the real GDP per capita is 3 times higher than the one of Kenya. The energy production is double the one of Kenya, and, for example, exports and imports are 10% higher. The next table, table 2, displays the weights of each controlled state in the synthetic Kenya. So the economic predictors of Kenya before the post-election violence of 2007 are best reproduced by a combination of Angola, Benin, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Senegal and Zambia. And Benin accounts for 50% because in all the economic growth predictors, except energy production, are really similar to the ones of Kenya. For example, the population density is 72 in Kenya, 77 in Benin, agriculture value added is 27 in Kenya, 32 in Benin, services 54, industry 1813, GDP per capita 1,044, and 1,057 for Benin. The figure 3 is the main figure of the paper, which shows the per capita GDP evolution of Kenya and its synthetic country for the 2002-2007 period. So you can see that this figure, combined with the high suitability of the economic predictors that we saw in Table 1, provides a sensible approximation to per capita GDP that Kenya would have experienced in the period of 2007-2011 with the absence of post-election violence. So the effect of the post-election violence on per capita GDP is the difference between the two lines. And it is seen that after the election took place in 2007, the GDP per capita in Kenya started to decline while the synthetic Kenya keeps ascending. So this, in the next figure, the yearly the GDP gap between the two lines. And you can see that in 2009 is when the effect the biggest gap is found. So the result, over the period of 2007-2011, per capita GDP was reduced by an average of $60 per year, which amount to be 5% of the 2007 baseline level. In 2009, the per capita GDP in the actual Kenya, which was where the gap was bigger, was found to 6% lower than its synthetic counterpart. So the advantage of using this method is that you can conduct placebo studies, which are falsification exercises. You still have to answer the question regarding the significance. What if those results are obtained by chance? If you run these falsification exercises and you find an effect of similar or greater magnitude than the ones you obtained before, this will undermine the validity of the results. So we conduct two types of falsification exercises. First one, reassigning the intervention in time, which are called in-time placebos, and then reassigning the intervention to the units that have not been exposed. So the first type of falsification exercise is called in-time placebo. So we do a placebo for the period before the election took place. So we calculate the effect for the 2002-2007 period, considering that the elections took place in 2005. And the results, it's in figure 3. The synthetic Kenya almost exactly reproduced the actual Kenya, and the GDP per capita does not diverge after the false elections took place in 2005. We conduct another placebo study to the units that are not exposed. So we compute the root mean square predictor error after the 2007 for Kenya and for all the donor pool countries. So it is found that Kenya is after Ghana, the country with largest ratio between the post-2007 and pre-2007 root mean square error. The post-election gap is about 15 times larger than the pre-election gap. And Ghana has also a large ratio because macroeconomic management, along with high prices of gold and cocoa, helped to sustain the GDP growth between 2008 and 2011. For example, in 2011, the GDP in Ghana grew at 11.76%. So a p-value can be computed. The probability of obtaining a post-election root mean square predictor ratio as large as Kenya is 0.091. And this is the formula. So as you see, here are the root mean square predictor error of all the countries of the donor pool, and it is seen that Kenya is after Ghana, the one with the highest one. And just the conclusion to wrap up, the synthetic control method, it is used to conduct a weighted combination of potential African countries that approximates the most relevant economic growth predictors that we show. We studied the effect of the post-election violence in Kenya after the 2007 elections. Over the period of 2007-2011, per capita GDP was reduced by an average of $70 per year, which amounts to be 5% of the 2007 baseline level. In 2009 is where the gap was higher, and per capita GDP in the actual Kenya was 6% lower than its synthetic counterpart. And we construct different falsification exercises to analyze the significance of the estimates, and the probability of obtaining the same magnitudes will be 0.91%. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. I now wear my discussant hat rather than my chair hat. This is a really interesting study, not least because I work on Somalia, and this is one of those things that we might be messing up each other's conclusions in a way. My first comment on this is that I find this post-election effect absolutely massive compared to the numbers that you showed, with about 1,200 people killed, property destroyed, 360 acts of sexual violence. I wasn't really sure about what channels you have got to explain a relative drop in GDP per capita of about 6%. Another figure that you have is 8% in the paper, with slightly different assumption. Somebody else has done a similar study, and they're a little bit below, but still 3.7%. I find that a bit big compared to the channels that you have outlined. So I think I'd like to know a little bit more about what you think is actually going on. Not least because there is a history of violence around elections, and your effect only sets in after that, after the election, but in a way there should be a forward-looking effect, because election violence is nothing new in this particular context. So I would like you to tell me why we should be so surprised, why people should have been so surprised and all the effect is afterwards rather than beforehand. And the third thing that wasn't really quite clear from the way that is written is how innovative this paper is. There is a suggestion within the paper that you're using an off-the-shelf software and just populating it with African data, which are slightly different than a competing study by Dimitri 2011. So I think I'd like you to sell the paper a bit better.
Okay.
I'm sure it is, but it just doesn't really come across. And this methodology is the Abadi and Gardiazabal type idea of creating a synthetic country, what they did with the Basque region, making a synthetic Basque region without violence out of the rest of Spain. So I'd like to see more of how you distinguish yourself from that. I was wondering also whether you could do the placebo study in a slightly different way by matching to 2008 and then seeing whether you find a divergence in 2009. If you put the date early, but I'm wondering what happens, what you would do what would happen if you say, well, what if the election is 2008? Maybe there is something else that goes on in that particular region that might, for example, put Sudan in your donor pool, or in the actual donor country. So that brings me to my final question, and that is the question, do you really see this result of a 6% drop in GDP per capita as the cost of running a dishonest or corrupt or violent democracy? Or would you have given me exactly the same answer if I'd asked you, what is the effect of instability in Somalia and the Ethiopian invasion of Mogadishu and Somali piracy on the Kenyan economy? I'm working on piracy in Somalia. We're doing exactly the opposite and saying, well, what's the effect of Somali piracy and tourism? And everyone always says, yeah, but it could have been the Kenyan election violence. So I'm wondering whether you had some thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you very much. So to start with the first question, that the numbers of the people killed and the people displaced may not reflect the 6%. I mean, what are the channels through this drop of GDP? First of all, the foreign direct investment was reduced as part of the violence, of the post-election violence. And another figure which was reduced was tourism, a lot. And Kenyan GDP depends a lot on tourism. So in the next years after the elections, people was a bit like, should we go to Tanzania or Kenya? Let's go to Tanzania because we may not have problems there. And also the inflation rose. It was the year of the election in 2007. It was 9%, and it rose to 26% in 2008. So that was also a problem. Can you repeat the second question, please? I mean, if I was surprised by the results, or what?
Well, everyone expects violence to occur around. If you expect violence to occur around the election, then people might be moving their assets out of these regions in advance of the elections, and presumably it would be quite predictable where it's going to happen. So I'm wondering why this is such a surprise in the data, why the diversion doesn't happen in 2006 in anticipation of this.
Yeah, for example, in this, there were elections held the 4th of March this year in Kenya, and many NGOs and firms told their employees, for example, international NGOs, to go back to their homes, just to see if the election was violent or not. Actually, the election that was taken 2 weeks ago was quite peaceful, because there was a change in the constitution in 2010. Also, all the media was telling people to calm down, not to go to the streets and try to fight for having a non-corrupt election. And the election, because Raila Odinga was also presented in this election, and Kenyatta was the one who won the election. So Raila Odinga is again saying that the elections were corrupt, but he said that they want to go through the court. So he's not telling the people to go to the streets and try to fight for a peaceful election. They say people to calm down, that the justice has to be the one in charge of alleviating that corruption. The third question was how innovative the paper is. And this method is quite new. It has been used in 3 studies that I didn't have time to put here. First was one who measured the economic cost that ETA, the clandestine Basque organization, had in the Basque economy. Another one related to the reunification of West Germany, the effect that has on West Germany. And another one was the Proposition 99, that it was a tobacco program that it was performing in California. So what that effect had on California. But this method has not been used to measure the conflict in any African economies. And there was a paper, as you said, that written by Dimitri, who also compared the Kenyan evolution after the 2007 election with other countries, but it was just a simple comparison. It didn't do a weighted average, so it just compared the exports, while I compared different economic predictors, and he used just a simple combination of other countries that he chooses. Then the fourth question is what would happen if in the placebo you put that if the elections would take place in 2008. But the thing is that if you perform that placebo study and you consider that the elections took place of 2008, you cannot, because the elections actually took place in 2007. So if you put the date of the elections in 2008, there will be a diversification of Kenyan synthetic counterpart. So that's why we took the period of 2002, 2007, because there is no election taking place in that period. So we want to see, for example, if that was a mistake of the program. For example, if you put 2005 the election, will they diverge even though there is no election? So that's why we used the period until 2007. And was that it, or?
I think we might give other people also a chance to ask questions at this point. Alan.
Thank you. It is true that in 2008 there was a drought in Kenya. For example, the paper of Dimitri says that the percentage they obtained was not only because of the post-election violence, but also for the drought of 2007 and 2008. The good thing about this method is that measures, you can say the exact same date when you want to start measuring the effect. So the drought was among all 2008. Sorry. But in the program, you say from 2007, what was the effect? It could be that the drought is also part of the 6%. The yearly gap was in 2009 6% lower, so it may be part of the effect of the drought also. Yeah.
Were any of the countries used to generate the synthetic Kenya also affected by the drought?
No.
When you think about the actual figures, in comparison to other studies, are these big, or are they very large in terms of because you've got 5%, would you say, of baseline GDP over 5 years, is that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's actually quite low as a percentage of GDP for a post-conflict.
So.
Sorry. Basically, I'm asking you, how do your figures relate to other estimates within the cost of conflict?
Okay. Mm-hmm. It was, for example, 600,000 people were displaced. So you don't only lose the FDI, the tourism, the increase in inflation, but also all the works that those people had. 600,000 people were displaced. So the economy starts to perform also poorly. And because also of the drought, many agricultural jobs were lost. So that's maybe why.
So, no, I just don't know how big were your numbers relative to other studies?
You mean in terms of measuring economic cost?
Yes.
Well, I haven't. Well, the ones of Abadi and Garriazabal, they found that there was a 10% drop in GDP per capita that ETA performed in the Basque Country. So this one was lower, but I haven't read all other studies that measure with this method the conflict. Yeah. Thank you.
There are 2 more questions. We'll take them together.
So I may have missed this, but I was wondering a little more about how the weights were generated for the synthetic control. And also in that methodology, how many of the factors or variables that generated the weights were related to tribal conflict or propensity.
Okay,
Yeah, we'll take the other question as well, and then.
Your graph seemed to indicate that the shock to change was permanent. So basically, this change of 6% would go on forever. That seems hard to believe in terms of the reasons given for the effect of jurisdictions being the which was supposed to be temporary.
So to start with your question, the change, it starts, it goes down, and the peak is in 2009, but then it starts to catch up with what Kenya would have before. And I am assuming that after maybe 2-3 years, it could converge to the one of the synthetic Kenya, but you have lost that economic growth in those years. So I think it will converge, but we still have to wait a bit to see what would have happened. And the question, just quickly, because I couldn't explain the methodology. So these are how the weights are chosen. So first, W is a vector of non-negative weights that sum up to 1. So what we do is you have a set, the importance of, the weights are chosen so the synthetic Kenya best reproduce the characteristics of the overall Kenya post-election violence. So X1 is the vector of the pre-intervention values of the economic growth predictions for Kenya, and X0 is the matrix for the other donor pool. So what you do is minimize with respect to W this vector. So you obtain the optimal weights that best resemble and mimetize Kenya. So then this weight is used, the optimal weight is used to compute the difference on the outcome variable that is GDP per capita.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Both for your presentation, for fielding those difficult questions. The second paper is by Michael Dorsch. Macro shocks, regulatory quality, and costly political action.
Okay, thank you very much for coming to the macro conflict session. This is joint work with one of my colleagues at American University of Paris and another economist at Université Cergy-Pontoise, which is on the northwest suburb of Paris. So I always like to start a talk by telling you what the title means, since that's arguably where all of the action is. Macro shocks, regulatory quality, and costly political action. By macro shocks, we're really talking about transitory economic contractions, so deviations from long-run growth trends, negative deviations we focus on here. Regulatory quality, so we're modeling a non-democratic political economy story here, where the choice variable for the autocrat is the degree of distortionary rent-seeking regulation that gets implemented. So by regulatory quality, we're talking about the lack of such distortionary rent-seeking policies. And costly political action, so we've got a game situation between the elite ruling class and the disenfranchised working class, and the only mechanism for affecting the leadership transition is for the working class to engage in what we call costly political action. Costly in the sense that it takes time, it risks punishment, and the result is uncertain. Okay, so that's kind of what we're talking about. That will allow me, I guess, to go through relatively quickly through the theoretical bit, which I'm only going to gloss over, give you the main idea, and then spend more time on the empirics. Okay? So there's a really prominent idea in economics and political science that negative macro shocks increase the probability of some sort of conflictual political action, some sort of political violence. The conventional wisdom is really following an opportunity cost story, being that when you have a negative macro shock, this changes changes the cost of political action directly. It's the opportunity cost of the would-be insurgents' time. So when they see their wage rates go down, then all else equal, insurgency appears more attractive. So there's a higher probability that they engage in it. So the logic of this ultimately goes back all the way to Becker with his famous theory of crime and punishment. This is something that Chris Blattman has recently kind of mentioned. We take a slightly different approach to this and highlight the informative nature that macro shocks might have about the quality of the political leadership. Okay? So we're essentially applying the ideas from the democratic political agency with imperfect information to a non-democratic political economy story. Okay, so these would be the classics in this literature. So in our story, negative macro shocks indirectly affect the calculus of costly political action through some sort of an informational role. So I'm gonna not talk too much about the theory because I'd rather show you the empirics, I think. But as I said, we've got an elite ruling class choosing policy, and we have a disenfranchised working class who are choosing costly political action or not in response to the economic outcome that they observe. The key to the story here is that workers only observe the economic outcome. They make inferences about the autocrat's type based on the economic outcome that they observe. So the story, I mean, the whole theory started in a bar, honestly, where we drew this picture on a cocktail napkin and said, hey, this would be kind of neat to do a theory on. So here's the story, and this would be better if these curves were further apart, but what these are is these distributions depend on the level of regulatory quality in place. Okay, so for more malevolent, let's say, or distortionary regulatory policy, the distribution of potential macro outcomes gets shifted to the left. Okay? And workers, what they know what the distributions are, they know the relationship between economic policy and macro outcomes, but they don't observe the macro policy, they only observe the outcome. That's the story. So if a worker observes a very bad macro outcome, a severe negative macroeconomic shock, he can make an inference that the probability that the autocrat is benevolent is very, very low. Okay, and that's going to affect the expected benefit, as it were, of engaging in costly political action, which could unseat the autocrat with some probability. So that's the story. I can come back to this if you have any questions about how we set up the model, okay? But for now, let's just kind of jump to the hypotheses that come out of this. Well, the first hypothesis is consistent with the opportunity cost story, and that is quite simply negative economic shocks are associated with higher probabilities of costly political action, which we use data on mass political protests to approximate. But the second hypothesis is something that we think is unique, and that is that this effect is stronger in autocracies that have rent-seeking regulatory policies in place. Okay, so in other words, the impact of the political impact of the macroeconomic shock is conditional upon the policies that are in place. Okay, so that's what we've got. Now, actually, let me point out that this is we think pretty different from the classic models of political transition, in which the incentives to take over a state are to take control of fiscal policy and implement a redistribution away from the elite towards the working class. Okay, in the traditional models, that's the incentives. Here, the incentives are to reform the economic institutions. Okay, so I think that's also something that is a bit unique about this. I could be wrong about that. Okay, so empirically, what we'd like to do, well, we'd like to investigate our two hypotheses. So our first 2 points there are the first two hypotheses. The 3 and 4 I've got in gray because I'm not going to have time to get to this, I don't think, but we correct for potential endogeneity bias using methods that Professor Miguel has employed. We think that we've got an intuitive enhancement of those methods. So hopefully I'll have time to get into that. And finally, estimate the political consequences of mass protests. This I'm not going to have time to get into, but given that there are mass protests, what is the probability that those affect irregular political turnovers, okay? At this point, let me mention that we're not modeling democratization. We're essentially, we're more modeling political turnover in autocracies, okay? And we're saying that costly political action is a mechanism for achieving that. Okay, so we are not focused exclusively on Africa in our empirics. We look at a panel, the biggest panel of autocratic countries that we could get, 37-year unbalanced panel, where autocratic status is determined by polity four score. So our baseline sample takes all the countries with polity score less than 4, but we do a series of robustness checks to look at different sample definitions, and the result seems to be relatively robust to alternative samples. The binary variable is costly political action, data on which we get from reports of political protests greater than, I believe, 1,000 people in the New York Times in a given country year. So we have a binary dependent variable that takes value 1 if there's at least 1. Again, we have alternative dependent variables that look at, it's binary if there's at least 3. We also do, just simply a count binary variable. Unfortunately, we don't have information on the intensity of these protests. That would be much better, but we don't have that. So we construct macro shocks from measures using real GDP from World Development Indicators. To approximate regulatory quality, we use a subcategory about regulation and the extent of market distorting regulation in the economic freedom measure from the Fraser Institute. We control for demographics, education, quality of institutions, long-run growth trends, and other stuff in robustness analysis. So in the paper, we look at 4 different measures of macro shocks. I'm only going to have time to talk about one of them today, and that is a truncated growth measure. So we assign 0 to the variable if there's positive growth, and -1 times the growth rate to get the negative growth in absolute term, just for ease of interpretation. So all the regressions, standard error clustered at the country level, country near fixed effects. And to test hypothesis 2, what we do is we regress the protest binary variable on the economic shock, but we interact the shock variable with regulatory quality. So just to give you a flavor of the results, with no controls, we see, yes, the absolute value of negative growth shock increases the probability of a protest by about 4.3%, and that effect is mitigated in countries with better regulation in place. So this is, you can see that this result is stable across this battery of linear probability models. Here we have our standard control set. Here we control for a lag-dependent variable. So this is just kind of a crude way to control for any possible endogeneity before going into a full-blown instrumental variable strategy. And here we interact the shock variable with other proxies for development levels, so as not to relax concerns that regulation here is just picking up or is proxying for overall development levels. And indeed, the interaction term is robust when we include the interaction also with the overall development levels. So I'm running out of time. About 2 minutes, it seems? Okay. So ultimately, we are aware of the clear potential for endogeneity here, but interaction terms are pretty difficult with instrumental variable analysis. They're difficult with probit and logits. So a strategy that we had is really quite simple, to do a subsample analysis and to break up the sample at the median regulatory score for the sample and see what the effect is of negative macro shocks in the bad regulation sample versus the good regulation sample. So that's pretty straightforward. The linear probability model, here we see positive and significant in the bad regulation and no effect in the good regulation. Same result using logits, that's nice. Endogeneity, so we use weather instruments, and as Professor Miguel was saying, there's recent evidence that temperature level is quite important, and this, to our knowledge, has not really been used that much as an instrument. Well, we go through all this with change in rain, change in temperature, and temperature levels, and for the sample that we have, surprisingly, the instruments, well, they're valid, but they're pretty weak. So in order to improve the strength of our instruments, we follow really the result from Dell, which indicates that development underlying development level matters for the relationship between temperature and economic growth. So we interact the instruments with development quartiles. Upon this interacting with development quartiles, they turn out to be quite strong. After doing this in the bad regulation subsample with a full battery of controls, we get each point of negative growth increases the probability of protest by 6.6%, which seems to be a pretty big effect. This is robust to a wide variety of things. The first two I've already mentioned: alternative specifications of dependent variable and macro shock, alternative policy cutoffs for sample determination, use of alternative regime classifications, various tricks with the sample, and controlling for oil, gas, mineral wealth, leadership tenure, and alternative GDP data. So I'll wrap up there. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So our discussant for this is Laura.
Yeah, I will say this. I will just say two quick comments. One, you have used for the you control for the quality of political institutions using public quality. I was wondering if you have considered to use other variables for deciding quality of political institutions. For example, economic freedom is done by the Heritage Foundation. It also has different economic variables that look at the quality of political institutions. And also, I was wondering how do you divide the sample of controversies into good and bad regulations?
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, that's it.
So we're definitely kind of still working on providing an acceptable set of robustness checks for our empirical work. This seems to be a never-ending process sometimes. But yeah, so it wasn't in the paper that you had. It's not there. But so we used the I don't know how to say that guy's name. Przewalski et al. Their kind of regime classification, which isn't, it's a binary kind of democracy autocracy thing. So maybe it's not as good as a control for political institutions. So I think that's a good suggestion. That we look at some additional controls there. The good versus bad regulation subsamples. So basically, we sorted the countries in terms of their regulatory quality at the beginning of the panel. So in 1970, or the first date that we had data for them, and we just simply put regulatory score lower than the mean into the bad regulation subsample, lower than the median into the bad regulation subsample, and greater than the median into the good regulation subsample. It's certainly nothing admittedly, it's not too sophisticated, I don't think. But it was kind of how our method for kind of dealing with how to investigate this conditional effect of the macro shock on some underlying variable without using interaction terms, which, we just had, we tried doing it using interaction terms in an instrumental variable context, but the papers that we would see to use as kind of a reference for how to do this, more often than not, people that cited those papers were just trashing them. So we decided, perhaps, since none of us are kind of theoretical econometricians, maybe it's not worth getting into this mess and just doing a subsample analysis for the IV part. But I think given the bias that we uncover in the endogeneity thing, the sign on OLS, simple linear probability models, is correct. So the bias, if anything, that we uncover reinforces our confidence in the sign on the linear probability model, which we can use the interaction terms for, because that is our preferred specification.
So I was just wondering about the balance of the outcome variables. So whether it's a very rare event, whether it's positive, or if it's
It was actually, there was a higher likelihood in the good regulation subsample. The unconditional probability in the good regulation subsample was about 21%, and the bad regulation was about 19%. Now, these are, and that's in the binary variable where there's at least one, right? So I mean, we're talking about one political protest of at least 1,000 people. One thing that we'd certainly like is to have an alternative dependent variable. We're not quite satisfied with that one. Yeah. In our baseline sample, yeah. Oh, because it's quite simply, there's 21 possible scores. So we wanted to 7, 7, 7. So we got, I guess, 2/3 of the observations, 2/3 of the possible polity scores when we chose the cutoff with 4. And if you look at how they define polity score of 4, for example, Russia has a polity score of 4 in, I guess, throughout the 2000s. So Russia, isn't in our sample. So we have institutions in our sample that are worse than Russia, I guess. If that. Yeah, we did it. We defined the sample at 0 cutoff. We defined it at 2, and we defined it at 6. And it seems to be relatively robust. The magnitudes change a bit, but the significance levels are about the same. Yeah. Country and time.
When you see the data set, you have more time data set.
Yeah.
More observation. So your data is more time series than
No, the contrary. Yeah, sure.
when the data is more of cross-sectional, the time is small, but the observation is wide, fixed effect is more effective. But your data set is like 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
so more of time series than cross-sectional. So the more it could be more it should be more of time series because you have more of autocorrelation problem than so because of that, we should have to imply more of time series analysis That's my suggestion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good suggestion, actually. I mean, it's on our list of stuff to do, not explicitly like with a Garch model, but with a generalized moment of method, something. So yeah, that's certainly on our list of things to do. I agree with you. It would be something reasonable and important to do. I mean, crudely, this is kind of why we checked to see if everything was robust to having a lagged dependent variable. So that's kind of a crude way to get at that. Of course, that only covers one lag when the underlying dynamics could be, as I think you're indicating, more like 5, 6, 7, 8 year lags that matter. So thank you for reminding me that that we still have to do that. It's valuable.
So you say you're collecting your outcome variables from your times report?
Yeah.
Are you worried that there might be systematic bias in the kind of regimes that you covered more than others?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Yes, absolutely. So that piece of data actually we got from an interesting paper by Burke and Lee, which is 2010 American Economic Journal Macro, who look at the effect of macro shocks on democratic change events. And we really liked that paper, and that, you know, their data set was kind of the starting point actually for the work for this work, to which, you know, we added some of the weather variables, we added the regulation variable. But deep in their appendix, they control for these protests, and you know, we were thinking to ourselves that, you know, the model that we had in mind was not really a model of democratization, because we don't really. And if you look, you know, if you look at the data, it's a relatively rare event, right, to have like a revolution result in democracy. I mean, most transitions seem to be, you know, coup d'état, which oftentimes seem to be triggered by protest activity. So that we kind of we were really happy when we saw that piece of data in their data set. And yes, we do worry about that, and that is actually the number one thing on our to-do list, is to find an alternative variable to use for our dependent variable.
You might try the Global Peace Index people. They've got a probability of major rioting and mass protests.
Just in Oslo?
No, they're Australia, aren't they, Paul?
Oh.
Global Peace Index people. Sydney, I think.
Yeah,
Paul,
I mean,
you had a question? One more question, Paul? No.
I think that's a good comment. We've got another paper where that's the action is like an inter-elite competition in the face of economic shocks. For this one, I mean, so I didn't get into the model, but we like this idea that there's somehow uncertainty about the autocrat's policy choice, right? So this is kind of based on Acemoglu's model of inefficient institutions, where there's a possibility that the autocrat can impose barriers to entry on entrepreneurs, and this will, you know, reduce the demand for labor, reducing the wage rate, and then the connected firms can make abnormal profits, right? So, you know, we like the idea that maybe the workers can't see this happening and they don't know what's going on. So that's kind of where how we link, well, kind of like unify some of Acemoglu's papers and add in this kind of element of political agency with uncertainty. So it's really just, yeah, I mean, your comment is absolutely right on, I think. But for the moment, it is what it is. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Good, thanks.
Okay, I don't have a pocket, so I can't walk around with that thing, so I will just have to speak from here. War and Famine, Peace and Light. The inspiration for the title was a Somali proverb that says, war and famine, peace and milk. So peace is associated with the good life. So we went for peace and light because we're using light emissions as a proxy for availability of milk and other good things. It's joint work with Katerina Christopoulou, who's a geographer, and Haris Makasoros, who's an engineer. So a truly interdisciplinary paper and forthcoming in Journal of Peace Research now. There is a large literature on the war economy, which is so sidelined in economics that I wasn't actually aware of it until one of my referees pointed me towards it. It's a literature that's very qualitative. The idea is that there are a lot of wars that just drag on and on and on because nobody actually wants to win it. The state of war is, in fact, an alternative form of organizing an economy. So there are lots of economic opportunities that are only available because there is an absence of government. Some people know me as the pirate queen. It's not a coincidence that piracy thrives in Somalia. The sort of violent entrepreneurship, plunder, looting, kidnapping, banditry, piracy thrives in the absence of a state that imposes law and order, and the people who do it and might do it quite profitably don't want a state to put a stop to it. Armed groups can provide state-like functions, so protectors get themselves established, protect a certain territory, and then tax any economic activity within it. They license businesses, they make sure that only some people deliver world food aid, things like that, and they live rather well off it. So there is an almost polemic and panicky literature about the problems of international aid in these contexts, the fact that aid can be diverted and can be manipulated so that you deliberately create pockets of hunger and then make sure that the people move to certain humanitarian strongholds in which the aid gets delivered and the local mafia-type structures then take a large part of it. So what are the key war economy hypotheses? Well, the first one would be that whoever provides stability does provide a desirable service in terms of enabling some form of economic activity. So stability in itself is a good thing. The poor benefit from stability, and it does not have to be provided by a state. Elite incomes should probably be relatively resilient to conflict. If they weren't, if the elites on balance suffered from conflict, then they would stop it. They might occasionally suffer from conflict in the sense that it's redistributive, but they might, some will be getting some and some will be losing that. So overall, we think it's probably quite resilient. However, if the conflict is further away, it might actually bring benefits, because if they're fighting in Mogadishu and you want to invest in Somalia, then you might think Hargeisa or Garowe or Bosaso is the up-and-coming place. You might want to deliver your food aid through there. That's where you might want to locate your telecommunications business. And then finally, the refugees are an asset that can be exploited. So if there is a World Food Programme distribution center in a city, then times of high migration and a humanitarian emergency could actually be something that's really positive to a local economy. All of this has been described at length for all sorts of African conflicts, but it hasn't been tested statistically, and this is the point of this paper, because we were looking at that literature on using nightlight emissions as a proxy for disposable income, and saying, hey, we can actually restore these unrecorded economic histories because we've got nightlight data going back to the early 1990s. So Henderson et al. And a number of other people have done a lot of work proving that in statistically challenged, less developed countries, looking at nightlights is actually a really good idea to supplement data that are collected on the ground. And the more challenged and more corrupt and more poor a country is, the more weight you should put on all these nightlights data, which after all capture not just what's going on in the official economy, but also what's going on in the underground economy. And we can sum the nightlights in all sorts of ways, at the district level, at the provincial level, at the country level. We're looking at city-shape polygons. We're using the National Oceanographic Administration images of the annual global stable nightlights from 1993 to 2009. There are 5 different satellites that were operational during this period with different sensor settings. When we're looking at the light intensity of these city pixels, and each of them is about a half kilometer square. The existing literature all says, let's look at this as a supplement, as an additional piece of information for terrestrially recorded data. Well, in Somalia, we don't have terrestrially recorded data. So we're talking about an unrecorded economic history. I hope to convince you that in the absence of data, at least in Somalia, these data are particularly good. They're not particularly abundant, and there are not that many light recordings at all. The sensors are not sufficiently sensitive to pick up anything, any type of settlement that hasn't developed some sort of mixed-use urban activity. So a fire in the countryside is not going to turn up on the stable night lights, and if people just sit in their hovels and have got the windows closed, then again, you see nothing. So what we do see is the provincial capitals and the harbours of northern Somalia. We see more lights over time in general, but some cities just disappear completely from view some of the time, which is interesting. Why is it such an excellent proxy for disposable income? Well, there is hardly any public provision of lights, so it is really what people can generate privately. They're very small firms with diesel generators, some bigger, some smaller, and people locate these diesel generators in the neighborhoods, and then they offer contracts to people for 1 light bulb, for 3 light bulbs for 2 hours, for a refrigerator and 5 light bulbs, whatever it is. So it is very, very sensitive. There are no ratchet effects. Once you've got a nuclear power station online, you need an earthquake to switch it off, pretty much. Here we don't have these ratchet effects. We don't have large-scale generating capacity. And they seem to be highly sensitive to income and food prices. So in 2008, you suddenly see the entirety of Somalia going darker, and you see that the mother at the margin is making that decision. Is it going to be another bowl of rice, or is it going to be homework? And you can see how it goes. So this is the data, the blown up, that I'm working with. You can see Hargeisa, the capital of Somaliland, growing a lot larger, but the intensity of emissions also growing significantly stronger. Garowe is the capital of Puntland. It wasn't visible at all in 1993. By 2009, it is there, and you can see there's also some light intensity coming from it. Mogadishu, if you look at the refugee literature, and they say the center of Mogadishu has become a ghost town. You can see that. That is pretty obvious that this was a city that was rich and well lit, relatively rich and well lit in 1993. By 2009, it's you can start crying. You can also see the Afgoy corridor going out to to the airport. All this is refugee camps in Scrubland. Refugee camps are actually really well visible because they're living under these canvas tents, so the light emissions are rather good. The literature, the existing literature uses the total light output from a certain area over which the light emissions are summed. But we're thinking, well, actually, we might have a lot more information in this data set, in that we can see that these cities are growing and contracting, and sometimes disappearing. And we can see that the intensity of light emissions in the center changes over time. So we've got an extensive margin where areas gain and lose power, and an intensive margin of how much is being used in those areas that are already accessing power. We go to the literature that looks at geospatial mapping within Somalia, and we find that this is a very medieval settlement pattern, in that the rich live in the center. The business district is generally right in the center, and the poor are literally marginalized. So what we're proposing is that the extensive margin, we're not picking up high-end suburbs, but we're picking up the access of the poor to power, whereas the central light emissions are the light emissions of the rich. So we use the EDAX data set that gives us geolocated conflict data. It's probably the best data set there is for our purposes, because EDAX does not limit the data collection to specific conflict diodes or specific conflict intensities. So we analyze changes in the light output, the size of towns, which gives us the change in the size of towns, gives us a proxy for what happens to the marginalized poor communities, and the maximum light emissions, what happens in the center of the cities. As I said, we don't have a lot of cities. We've got 14 cities, and not all of them are available for all of the years. We only use strictly positive observations, and we don't use Mogadishu, because Mogadishu has very different patterns. As well as being the most violent city, it also has a lot of aid that is specifically targeted at light generation, and has obviously got military camps, which are also well lit. We control for exogenous shocks, such as rain and international food prices, and we've used fixed and random effects panel regressions and dynamic panel estimators. Pretty much whatever we do, we see that there are very significant peace dividends for the poor. So exactly as you would expect, that if a city is peaceful, regardless of who provides that governance within it, that is a good thing for the poor. They do get access to electricity. The towns grow. We can't see any effect of local conflict on the light output from the city center. So nothing happens there. The rich do not suffer from local conflict. It is all about, all the changes happen at the city's margins. However, it's positively correlated with remote violence. So if other cities experience a lot of violence, that does seem to direct investment and economic activity towards the more stable city. We also see a positive spillover from violence in Mogadishu in those cities that have got a World Food Programme presence. And that's not just the center, the very center, the maximum light emission, but that seems to be a broader benefit to the economy. And yeah, as I said, food prices and precipitation levels is in accord with expectations. Food prices generally switch the lights off, and high rains, or better than average rains, stopping short of floods are a good thing for economic activity. So I'm only showing you part of it, But anyway, you can see this is the proxy, the light footprint for what's happening at the extensive margins to the poor, of a strong effect, negative effect from local violence and violence elsewhere, as possibly as people become internally displaced. The people at the margins of the city have to share with ever more people. Here is the effect on total light output, and you can see here this effect that we're rather worried about, that aid might be fueling conflict in the sense that the World Food Programme presence, with the contemporaneous shock of violence in Mogadishu, actually has a very positive impact on cities like Hargeisa, Bosaso, Garowe, where the food aid is distributed. So, given time, I'll conclude. I do think we've got evidence, statistical evidence here for a war economy where the rich don't actually mind the state in which the country is. They're insulated from the costs of conflict within their central business districts, and they might actually gain from conflict in Mogadishu because aid is attracted into the peaceful cities. The poor, however, would see a peace dividend. However, as long as governance in Somalia is arranged around this idea of power sharing among elites, the poor voice is not going to be heard. And the most recent efforts to try and get a new peace deal that is more democratic is certainly a step in the right direction, and that does make me feel a little bit hopeful for the future of Somalia, because the poor definitely have something to gain from a change in this direction. Thank you very much. I will leave you with one of my economic histories of one of the cities in Somalia. And as I said before, that is the city of Burao. In 1996, it disappears. Instead, we see a refugee camp that is opened. So those white tents with a little bit of light provided by the international community is actually better visible than the city, and eventually it gets subsumed into the city. In the analysis itself, we've of course just looked at the city, and we've taken away all those ephemeral lights associated with refugees or with military camps outside the cities.
Thank you very much, Andrzej. I could say just on a purely stylistic level, the paper is extremely smooth, easy to read. Not surprised to learn that it is forthcoming somewhere. Be that as it may, I have to take issue maybe with a couple of your interpretations. Primarily the one about the effect of aid. So it is the case that you do have a statistically significant and positive estimated effect on the interaction term, but as far as I can tell, you don't control for the uninteracted violence in Mogadishu. So while it's true that violence in Mogadishu increases light output in these WFP centers, without including the uninteracted effect, you can't say that the increase in income is greater than in the non-WFP regions, if I'm not mistaken. And so you didn't show table 5, I don't think, which is where your conclusion that the elite benefit from violence elsewhere. But at least in the version that I have, I can't see where that conclusion follows from the presented results, at least not with statistical significance. Finally, I think I have two comments about the data and how you interpret the elite groups versus the marginalized groups. This is extremely clever, I think, the way that you've gone about this. But I think it would be very supportive of your arguments to include some alternative definitions of what you consider to be elite based on the data that you have. Right? Because now, what you've got now, as I understand it, is a change in the elite income is a change in the light intensity in the brightest pixel, if that's correct. Yep. But the brightest pixel is only, as you say, 1 square kilometer, right? So, I mean, to buy that, I have to believe that all of the elite in the society are all living within the same square kilometer, right? So it might make sense to consider like a more kind of socioeconomic type definition of elite, like take what are the 5% brightest pixels, and then look at how the intensity changes in the 5% brightest pixels. And I would change, use different rules, right? Like try with 10%, try with 2.5%, whatever, or do like some sort of a ratio, an intensity ratio, all right? Like elite is defined if it is, 3 times as bright as the poorest, or 4 times as bright as the poorest, or something like that. Finally, I mean, to the extent that you believe that you can construct kind of income distribution data from these light emissions, I mean, this would be an enormous contribution, right, to construct income inequality measures for Africa, for countries where everybody, is always complaining, well, we think income inequality matters, but we don't have the data. So, I mean, this would be a huge contribution, I think, to economics in general, to construct some sort of inequality measures for these countries, which presumably you could do by reading what you've written. That's all.
Shall I briefly answer to some of these the questions? The aid effect, I haven't got non-interacted violence in Mogadishu, but given that the general violence data are very close to what comes from Mogadishu, and Mogadishu rather dominates that set, it's sort of in there. I can put it in separately, but then these variables start competing with each other. So again, sort of collinearity in there that I chose not to accommodate in the final version. Yes, I can certainly play around with having a broader definition of elite. It probably wouldn't make any difference. I mean, there's usually about 4 or 5 pixels in these centres that are on very similar levels. I don't think it would change the analysis, but it can certainly be done. We have cross-checked our results with what it actually looks like on the ground. So we've gone into the high-resolution satellite image analysis, and we have looked at where do the people have the cars, what sort of places are we looking at, and we are looking at an almost medieval society where the desirable properties are on the market square next to the mosque, because you don't have to spend hours and hours in a traffic jam or walking along a dirt road towards the centre, which is sort of more the Somali rather than the Dar es Salaam or Nairobi type experience. Your last question, I was extremely interested in trying to say we could possibly extend this idea of an income inequality measure through nightlights. The problem is that we cannot tell apart a high-end, low-density suburb from a very densely populated slum in terms of nightlights. So we are limited to the sort of economic and environments where the high-end suburb hasn't yet happened. And looking across Somalia, there's only one example of what is intended to be a high-end suburb in Hargeisa, and it was part of a speculative development that never took off. So the properties are all unfinished. So we have actually checked that for this particular case that isn't a problem, but I doubt that this would fly at all in places like Nairobi and Dar es Salaam because of that cheek by jowl living of very poor neighborhoods with very rich neighborhoods, and the way that the satellite images are taken, you can't guarantee that if you're in the middle of one pixel today, then the following year you still be right in the middle of that pixel either. So there are these very slight geographic shifts. So unfortunately, I would love it to work, but I don't think it will. Yeah. Paul, I'll take your question as well. Yeah, and just slightly running out of time. Yeah, I'll take your question as well, and then if people want to rush to another session, please feel free. They're the dependent variables. Yeah. Dependent. That's my outcome variable. Are those light? Yeah. Yeah, and lots of wonderful questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, in the paper, I make a much better case of saying there are different types of elites within Somalia, and there is one elite that is centered around protection, warlords, appropriation, diversion of resources. But there is also another economic elite, and that is the one that has the diaspora, and that brings in the diaspora investment. And they are much less dependent on the war economy. I mean, they're helpful for the warlords, because if they create economic activity, that is something that the warlords then can tax. But the diaspora doesn't have a direct stake, I don't think, in the continuation of the war economy. But there are a lot of people who have made their lives around running their own militias, appropriating resources, running roadblocks, taxing economic activity, taxing imports and exports. One of the major pillars of the Somali economy is the re-export of goods going into the border regions of Kenya and Ethiopia. So there is a lot of taxable activity if only you can protect it, and that's what these people do. But yeah, the paper makes that distinction, so that there is an up-and-coming elite that does not just depend on the war economy. Did I want to go public with the idea that aid is possibly a bad thing? It's not a result that I wanted to find, but in a way, reading all this literature, particularly about Somalia, of how aid is manipulated, how the World Food Programme delivers stuff into Somalia and it turns up all over the place again, except where it's wanted or most needed. That only 3 companies do all the trucking and make millions out of it. In a way, I don't want it, but I think I have to say that in this case that there is statistical support for that aid-critical literature in this particular context, and that we do need to think about it when we're planning aid. The war economy, I think there's a lot of pushback, particularly from Somaliland, saying, well, we have nothing to gain from conflict in Mogadishu, and I say, well, possibly not, but on the other hand, you have very little to gain from Mogadishu re-establishing central governance over Somaliland either. So even if there isn't a very strong positive economic impact from benefit from Mogadishu, from conflict in Mogadishu for the rest of the country, there isn't a negative impact, and therefore there isn't that burning desire to resolve this amongst the regional elites. I think I can go as far as that. I'm not saying you're benefiting from war and therefore you continue the war. I don't think that would be fair, but on the other hand, it's not the top of your wish list. You're much more worried about policing in Hargeisa than you are about what's going on in Mogadishu. Piracy and light. We're working on that with the World Bank. These places on the Puntland coast don't turn up on the annual stable night lights images, but we've got monthly data, and if we aggregate at the regional level and we look at ransom drops where specific ransom drop dates are associated with specific anchorages, we are seeing that the lights come on in these places. So that is certainly there, but it's econometrically quite difficult because it's one of those dose effects, because you get dose upon dose upon dose, but it's certainly there, and it really strengthens an argument that I've made for some time that piracy in Somalia is a community level, a crime from which a wider community benefits, and therefore if you want to look for a solution to piracy, you need to think about engaging with that broader community that benefits from these flows. So targeting the enablers of piracy rather than just the labour and the finance involved in it. But yeah, we'll talk later about pirates, I hope. Yeah, the data are getting better, and the econometrics is getting more convincing than my first shot. Well,